Hi guys, Mark Dawes, NFPS Limited, and I've got some really interesting news for you, which I thought I'd just share for you on a very short video. For years, people have been applying common sense when trying to look after vulnerable people, be it children or vulnerable adults. And one of the areas we've come across is where inspectors from various inspectorates have said that you cannot stop a child leaving a care home unless they're there by, mandated by the Secretary of State, so they're a secure children's home or they're there under a court order. Where that child could be placing themselves at risk. Interestingly, bizarrely, we've actually had one inspector say you can't do that unless the risk is immediate. So, you know that they're going to run out the home, and the example used was they're going to run under a bus. Well, the problem and the pressure this places staff under is when they're trying to look after vulnerable people who maybe at risk of being sexually exploited, and we've had cases of this in the press recently, young children being sexually groomed and being placed at risk by being allowed to walk out of a care home with no one stopping and challenging them. Now, we all know on numerous levels, morally and ethically, it's wrong. But the question is it legally right? So in other words, would you be breaking the law if you stopped a child from leaving a care home? Now, there's lots of arguments here about this, and I'm not going to cover it all in depth. I just want to bring your attention to a really interesting piece of legislation which came out in February. And here it is. It's called the Social Responsibility and Heroism Act 2015. And you can see it here. Here it is on the webpage. This is a direct webpage. You can go on the website and you can actually find this, the Social Action Responsibility and Heroism Act 2015. And it came into effect in February this year. Now, if we read the Act, it's quite interesting. It says when this Act applies, and it states, this Act applies when a court, in considering a claim that a person was negligent or in breach of a statutory duty, is determining the steps that the person was required to take to meet the standard of care. So basically, if someone, let's say, using the example of a child leaving a care home, went to stop that child, and an inspector or a manager said, no, you can't do that, and they were prosecuted for negligence because they were maybe harmed the child, albeit a reasonable harm, to stop the child from being exposed to greater harm, this could come into play. Now, we don't know for a fact whether it will, but it's an interesting piece of legislation. The next provision, number 2, social action, says the court must have regard to whether the alleged negligence or breach of statutory duty occurred when the person was acting for the benefit of society or any of its members. Well, just using that one example, and I'm sure this has a much broader application, it has to be in the benefit of society to look after children who are vulnerable. But let's move on and look at the next provision. Number 3, responsibility. The court must have regard to whether the person, in carrying out the activity in the course of which the alleged negligence or breach of statutory duty occurred, demonstrated a predominantly responsible approach towards protecting the safety of other interests of others. So this is just quite interesting because it said, of which the alleged negligence or breach of statutory duty occurred. So if we have a statutory instrument, some regulations, for example, that say, for example, hypothetically, you cannot stop a child from leaving a care home unless they are placed there under order of the Secretary of State or by a court order. So in other words, it's a secure care home. So let's say a member of staff, hypothetically, knew that a child was going to leave that home and they were at risk of being sexually exploited or physically abused or being given drugs or exposed to violence or whatever it is, because they have good evidence to support that fact, and they stop them from leaving. Technically speaking, they could be in breach of a set of regulations, the Children's Homes Regulations, for example. However, this Act of Parliament, the Social Action Responsibility and Heroism Act, seems to infer that if you're doing that and you are demonstrating a responsible approach, predominantly a responsible approach towards protecting the safety of others or another person, you seem to be protected by this Act. So let's move it on. Part 4, heroism. The court must have regard to whether the alleged negligence or breach of statutory duty occurred when the person was acting heroically by intervening in an emergency to assist an individual in danger. So once again, we have staff who have to intervene. They have to intervene, they have to physically control and restrain people in situations where someone is at risk, either the person because they're exhibiting challenging behaviour, or other people who are going to be affected by the anger or aggression or probably the violence exposed to them by that person. And we have regulations now that say, for example, you cannot use any technique which may cause pain with a child. But if someone breached that regulation and they used force, albeit reasonable, so it was necessary in the circumstances and the harm or pain they caused was proportionate to what they actually prevented happening, for example, stopping someone getting glassed, then, technically speaking, once again, they broke the regulations relating to that particular area of work. But this act was seen to say that if the person was acting heroically by intervening in an emergency, they're protected by this act. Let's look at the next provision. Part 5. Extent, commencement and short title. This act extends to England and Wales only, so sorry to our Scottish cousins there, but it doesn't seem to go that far. And sections 1 to 4 come into force on such day as the Secretary of State may, by regulations made by statutory instrument, appoint. So in other words, we're still waiting for regulations to come out to clarify this further, so it's still in its early stages. Regulations under subsection 2 may include transitional provision as the Secretary of State considers appropriate, and this section comes into force on the day on which this Act is passed, which was in February this year, February 2015. And this Act may be cited as a Social Action Responsibility and Heroism Act 2015. So this is brand new, it's hot off the press. I think it's a really interesting piece of legislation. We're looking at it in depth at the moment. We're looking to see what its potential application is going to be, because there are no case precedents because it's brand new. But if you consider some of the things I've spoke about already in this presentation, I think this could be quite an interesting and responsible act of Parliament to protect people who are acting responsibly and in the best interest of other people, albeit in doing so they may be breaking other statutory instruments to do so. So we're going to be discussing this at our seminar on the 9th of July. And I think this is going to be an absolutely interesting area of work, and we're taking some legal advice on it at the moment, and as soon as we have more information on this, I'll update you. Thanks for listening, guys.